Good evening and welcome to the interview on climate change communication. I am Aditi Sharma and I'm delighted to host this session where we will explore the role of newspapers in shaping climate change communication. Today, I have with me a very distinguished guest, Shri Reginald Royston, an esteemed Indian Forest Service officer of the Himachal Pradesh cadre. He earlier served as Deputy Conservator of Forest in Kinnaur and now currently serving as Deputy Conservator of Forest Wildlife Hamirpur. A very welcome to you, sir. In this
Thank you.
recorded in
Yeah,
this
thank you, Aditi.
recorded interview, I will aim to understand how climate change communication can be made more effective, the role of newspapers in shaping public perception, and the challenges faced in conveying climate-related issues to diverse audiences. Thank you, Reginald, for joining us today. Let's begin with the interview with the volley of questions that I have with me.
Yeah, sure, please.
Okay. How do you think that newspapers in Himachal Pradesh have typically framed climate change issues?
See, newspapers in Himachal generally report climate change in a more localized way. They don't largely focus on issues. The larger issue of climate change, or they tend to kind of omit or overlook the actual reasons behind climate change.
Mhm.
Although there's been a lot of reporting, particularly in the local newspapers, but it is more of when, for example, when there's a disaster, so then it becomes a news and then it's reported on the front page. But otherwise it just occupies a column in a corner of a page, or in the last page or so. So there is a lot of reporting. There is definitely more reporting in the local papers when you compare to previous years. There is more, there's a lot of conversation that goes around, particularly in the local papers, but it is focused on more of as to what is the kind of impact it has had on day-to-day lives of people, in the sense that if there is there is an economic loss, right? Or if there is any any impact that is sudden, if there is for example, there's been rains and houses have fallen, so then that becomes a news. Otherwise they tend to overlook the larger climate change issues, particularly when it comes to Himachal.
But do you think that they mention climate change in the newspapers? Do you really think that they mention the real reason? They may mention about the, say, floods or rains, but they don't actually mention climate change. Do you really think that they mention about it?
Yeah, exactly my point. I mean, they don't actually, they tend to overlook the the larger point of, or the larger issue of climate change. It is more of kind of, sometimes it's clickbait journalism, sometimes it is just it is just an headline that says, okay, flash floods have occurred, and so they don't go into the underlying causes as such, which is primarily climate change. So they tend to overlook a lot, although few papers do report it scientifically, but largely it is being overlooked.
Okay. Do you think newspapers present climate change as serious and urgent issue? Why or why not?
See, climate change, they do, I mean, newspapers do report climate change as a serious issue and as an urgent issue, but the kind of reporting they do, it is a serious issue when when, say, for example, if the rainy season comes. So at that point of time it becomes a serious issue and a very urgent issue. But in the long run, if you see, if there is a continuation of, if there is a conversation that revolves around on a daily basis, is that stressed upon on a daily basis, then it's a big no. They do discuss it, they are serious about it, which is why, I mean, at least there's a lot more talk on the mainstream newspaper media also these days. Whenever there is any destruction or any issues related to climate change, that is being taken upon seriously. But it is not, but the conversation ends on a certain point. They start, and as and when there is another issue that comes up, this conversation ends there only. So there is no such continuation, or in the long run, somewhere this issue gets dissolved. The urgency is very limited. in terms of time and in terms of space also, the kind of coverage they give in the newspapers, so because usually you don't see much of these issues being, you don't see it in the front page of a newspaper or even in the last page. It is somewhere in between, a column is dedicated. So and then when there is a flood or something, then it comes to the front page, so where people can see. So that is the kind of seriousness and urgency that newspapers show these days.
Okay. What, according to you, should be the responsibilities that newspapers must have in reporting when reporting on climate change in Himachal Pradesh?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I mean, the kind of, we talk about, responsible journalism. So I
Hmm.
think the first and foremost responsibility that journalists or, journalism should, abide by is, number one, it has to be scientific, particularly when it comes to climate change. It has to be, factual. The facts should be checked,
Hmm.
and it has to be ethical also. It should not be clickbait journalism wherein you create a fear amongst people. So it is about, when you report something, you go into the depth of the story. You get, that every story needs to have a scientific basis, and it has to be factual. I believe, I mean, it has to be fair enough to, both sides, and it has to, obviously there has to be, I mean, ethical issues are always involved. But I believe there is some, at some point there is a certain kind of lack of, scientific temperament when reporting, particularly, in the local papers. Catchy phrases, and they pick certain stories, as per your convenience, or and then quote from somebody, and maybe certain times those quotes are often misrepresented, or they might not be the actual quote said by an officer, or scientific. It might not have been verified by a scientific person. So I think the major, I think, responsibility would be that it has to be scientifically driven,
Hmm.
and it has to be factually checked, and it should be in such a way that it should be in a way that it creates a conversation amongst people, rather than fear mongering. So I think that is more important.
Okay. How can newspapers make climate change communication information more accessible and engaging for the public?
So yeah, climate change. I mean, I can quote an example. If you look at, these days, there's a lot of cartoon. I mean, cartoon is a very age old concept, and it is very catchy. Even to this date, I mean, in spite of all these, social media content and all that, still cartoons hold a lot of value.
Hmm.
The way they represent things. And I mean, you must have seen, there is a page called, there is a, I've seen a lot of cartoons in the name of green humor. So it is
Hmm.
very much engaging actually, and it kind of tells a story. So I
Hmm.
think one is climate change, although it is being talked about a lot these days through these cartoons and pictographically. So I think newspapers need to, evolve themselves into projecting climate change, into visually. It needs to be appealing, it has to be engaging, and it has to be emotionally appealing. So I think that is where, they can actually sell I mean, it is basically, you're selling a content, right? So
Hmm. Hmm.
newspaper, I mean, whenever there is a newspaper publishes a certain news, I mean, they are selling content.
Hmm.
So that content needs to be, appealing as much as possible. Although, I mean, we are discussing climate change here, even that can become a talking point only if there is if there is a storyline behind it, and if it is appealing, and if it is actually engaging, and emotionally it has to touch people. Because it's all about, marketing, and touching, telling a story in such a way that it creates an immediate impact, and creates a conversation among people. So I think that is how newspapers can actually engage, rather than, nobody these days would love to, read a 250 word essay, or editorial of, say, 1,000 words. Or there are people who read, I mean, that is something that needs to happen. But I believe there has to be a balance between, giving, a 200 page, I mean, 200 word essay, rather than conveying the same thing in a short cartoon format or something. I think that is how you can actually sell climate change as an issue to, you can sell it to the public.
That was a very insightful answer to this question. next question. Do you think newspapers write enough on local or regional climate change impacts, or does it prioritize national impact issues?
I believe, I mean, out of my experience, I believe newspapers in Himachal, they do cover a lot. I mean, because
Hmm.
I've been engaging with media personnel day in and day out, and I see a lot of coverage in the local papers.
Hmm.
And but I there is a certain lack of, uh, they don't actually project the overall climate change, or they don't take issues from the national or international level. Say, for example, when you talk of global warming, or when you talk of carbon credits, or the where the global scientific community is involved in, I don't think they talk enough about it. But whereas they do pick up, local papers do pick up issues that impact their lives, day-to-day lives, in a more local way. For example, say, I'm also I also take care of Pong wetland. It's an international wetland.
Hmm.
So, every day there is a conversation that surrounds around pond. How many
Hmm.
birds have come, are birds nesting, and
Hmm.
how many birds, is there an increase or decrease in birds. So, to that extent, there is a lot of conversation amongst the local papers,
Hmm.
particularly, with respect to, climate change. But it is more, whether it impacts my life here. If it does not, or they don't actually go into the larger cause or consequence of things. So, to that extent, local papers are doing a good job also.
Okay, perfect. Coming on to the next question, what do you think are the biggest challenges that journalists face when covering climate change in Himachal Pradesh? And I'm talking about from the point of view of a government official like you,
Right. I believe, I mean, you're asking the challenges that journalists face, right?
journalists face. Huh?
So, number one, journalists in Himachal, they lack data. I mean,
Mhm.
in the sense that they, in fact, even it is sometimes, these things are, not very easy to quantify. Also, they lack scientific data that backs any claim, that is being, if there is, for example, say, in Pong, I would again quote this example of Pong.
Mhm.
So there is this burning issue of agriculture, right? In
Mhm.
Pong, in the drawdown areas, people cultivate,
Mhm.
and when people cultivate, birds tend to come, and they perch upon the small grass and all that.
Mhm.
And when, now this is an issue which, when a journalist reports such issue, they
Mhm.
are kind of, they don't have the data as to tell whether is it a positive impact on these birds, is it related to, is it having a positive impact on these birds on conservation, or does it have a negative impact. So in their mind, or their understanding is that if more birds come, and and if there is cultivation, which means if there is encroachment, it means that birds may not come, and
Mhm.
if we don't do, if we stop cultivation, it means birds come in large number, they get more space to, nest and all that. But whereas they don't understand that birds in Pong generally don't nest in Pong, they are migratory birds, they nest in Siberia. So at some point they lack kind of scientific backing to their claims.
Mhm.
And secondly, they also, sometimes areas are also remote. I was also serving in Kinnaur. So in Kinnaur, there
Mhm.
was a flash flood in Kinnaur is something that's not heard of generally. That
Mhm.
probably happened due to a micro climate change. There was a sudden rainfall in the month of, April, May, May, I believe, when it is usually not expected. So it
Mhm.
led to a lot of flooding. And in a place like Nako, it's a cold desert. They only have snowfall. They've never heard of rainfall.
Mhm.
Now these are certain, the area being remote, and the issues also very new. So sometimes it becomes difficult for, journalists to actually pick up that issue. One is it is remote, the other is they do not have any, scientific data, and it is happening for the first time. So sometimes it is difficult for journalists to actually report such things. And yes, they also have a certain lack of access, or I wouldn't say lack of access, but on the global front, what's happening, what is actually happening,
Mhm.
they they do not have that, maybe I wouldn't say knowledge, but
Mm.
maybe somewhere that is not being taken into account when it is being reported. I think to that extent, they do need. I mean, it is our responsibility also to engage with them and to educate them, because we are at the forefront. We know what's happening. So it's
Mhm.
our responsibility also to actually empower them to understand that these are the global issues, and this is how to provide them with data proactively, so that they kind of report it in a more better way.
Another perfect answer. Coming on to the next question. Can you recall any particular positive or weak examples of climate change reporting in Himachal Pradesh newspapers?
Yeah, I mean, I would once again, I would talk about, I would like to again quote Pong wetland only,
Mhm.
wherein, I mean, I've seen both sides both sides of it.
Mhm.
Number one, to talk about positive reporting,
Mhm.
there's a one. The first thing is there's a lot of conversation about Pong wetland and the number of birds, and whenever the census happens, people journalists engage themselves in counting of birds. Whenever there is any encroachment, they immediately report,
Mhm.
and there's a lot of they report it in a very positive way. I mean, although it might be only for a certain time, only when we do the census or when the data is available, because sometimes when people read that more than 150,000 birds have arrived in Pong, now that becomes a great news. So that might be a reason, but it's a positive reason to report about. And they are quite happy and enthusiastic about reporting how many birds have come at Pong,
Mhm.
and from where they have come. What is the reason that the birds have decreased this year?
Mhm.
Last decade we've been doing it every year. So if there is any decrease in birds, so then they get agitated that these are the reason. They make us accountable that because
Mhm.
of your efforts birds have not come, although that might not be the reason. But
Yes.
still, it is quite happy to note that people are engaging. Journalists are particularly reporting this. So in fact, every day, whenever there is any any new species is reported, so they go into deep this thing, that they ask that what kind of species have been reported this time. Is it new, and where is it come from? So to that extent, that creates a lot of positive impact, particularly on the younger community in Himachal, and particularly in Kangra. So people are excited, about Pong, that so many birds have come. There's a new species that has arrived at Pong. That is
Mhm.
one way I see wherein positive journalism has worked. I mean, very well. I
Mhm.
mean, negatively, of course, when there is any decrease in count, or I wouldn't say negative. That is actually reporting only, but sometimes they don't go into the actual cause of it.
Mhm.
Uh,
Mhm.
Sometimes not necessarily the number of birds does not necessarily mean that the conservation measures have failed. It also depends on larger global factors, and sometimes there are a lot of reasons to it. The species variation decides whether your conservation efforts have succeeded or not, rather than the number. So to that extent, when they don't understand the actual reason, then it that also becomes news, right? Okay,
Mhm.
this year the numbers have decreased by 1 lakh number.
Mhm.
The reason might can be any number. They don't go into the reasoning, so that becomes kind of a negative this thing. But still, overall, I'm happy, or I mean, I think it's good news that at least there is talk about all these things in the
Mhm.
local papers, particularly.
Uh, do um do you think newspaper coverage has influenced government policies on climate change in the region?
Of course, I mean,
Mm.
of course, they have influenced a lot of policy making in general, also in general, in forestry subject, and in particularly in wildlife. When it comes to uh, Pond, I would say, the land. I mean, there are a lot of issues with respect to encroachment, and
Mhm.
people tend to cultivate land for a shorter period of time. These
Mhm.
things get reported in the
Mhm.
newspaper. So what happens is, that is where newspaper plays a great role, because even to this date, high courts generally take hold more credibility to newspapers rather than other other channels like Facebook or YouTube or other content. They hold, there's a lot of value to it. So when these things get reported in a very reputed newspaper, now that becomes, now they are directly holding the government accountable. So either directly or indirectly to the through the courts. Now in that case, the government is actually forced to act upon, in terms of being, even in other forestry subject, you would have seen high court, ordering to remove encroachments. And then government has, framed a policy as to, create a database for, forest I mean, where forest lands are available, what are the land banks, the database needs to be created, and illegal encroachments needs to be removed. So they hold the government directly responsible, in a very major way, and sometimes indirectly through, through courts and all that, because it becomes legal evidence whenever there is a reputed newspaper that publishes such news. Now government is forced to act, whether they like it or not. So to that extent, yes, I mean, uh,
Perfect. How do you think the readers of newspapers in Himachal Pradesh perceive the credibility of climate change news?
uh, it depends. I mean, how, one is whether, the information is trustworthy, whether the newspaper is trustworthy in the first place, and if the information or the article, it also depends on the kind of person who writes it, whether, are they, competent enough or capable enough to write. So there's always, the credibility lies on the newspaper, number one, and on the person writing, and definitely on whether on the information ultimately. And I think climate change, I mean, sometimes, certain issues might be politically motivated. And, Himachal being a very democratic state, and, there are a lot of issues that tend to carry a political mileage, or, kind of political tint towards it. So to that extent, I believe, there are a lot of, the public in general, they always believe newspapers hold a lot of credibility. When it comes to climate change, they see it as credible information, but it depends on, it depends on the kind of media outlet and the kind of person, and since people are more informed here, you cannot make a fool out of them, so to that extent, that is how, you can actually assess the credibility.
Um, Coming on to the next question, what role do you think that the newspapers play in countering misinformation or misconceptions about climate change?
Yeah, I mean, like I said earlier, newspapers hold a lot of value compared to other media, mainstream media. Like, there's a lot of false content and false information these days, be it Facebook or YouTube, or, any other platform you may call it. But to this date, newspapers hold a lot of, credibility, and they hold a lot of value, amongst the older generation. And I mean, it still has to pick up pace amongst the younger generation. But yes, they people still believe that newspapers information which is actually factual. So countering misinformation, and they also
Mm.
play a lot of. So to that extent, it is more educational also. And I don't think any other media can at least to this day, content.
Okay. How does newspaper reporting shape public understanding of climate change in Himachal Pradesh?
Still, newspaper is the most common wherein people rely upon. So they influence local people and public, and the kind of perception they carry about things. For example, say two three trees have been felled, then media immediately reports it. And then people, the local panchayat, or you might find people coming to our office, and to particularly the divisional forest officer's office, asking like who gave the permission to fell these trees, and under what law, or under how. And there are a lot of flood of articles which come in. And I believe newspaper changes, and it kind of they critically engage people.
Mhm. What
Lot of concern
strength?
being raised.
uh, Sorry, the
And
connection is getting weak in between. The picture, the video seems distorted.
okay, is it fine now?
Yes, I can hear you fine, but in between it gets paused. Coming on to the next question, please continue the answer that you were saying. I didn't mean to pause.
Okay.
Mm.
Yeah, I mean, so yes, understanding it, particularly newspapers and local media, they play a greater role in creating awareness, educating. And particularly there is a bias. I mean the older generation is more informed through newspapers rather than the younger generation. Maybe that's because of it's not a selling point among younger generation. To that extent, there's a long way to go for newspaper medium as such. But otherwise, they have they have played a huge role in shaping the understanding, particularly at a very local level.
What strength do you think newspapers have over other media platforms in informing the public about climate change in Himachal Pradesh?
Yeah. So am I audible?
Yes,
Your video stopped.
yes,
Yeah.
you're audible.
Am I audible, Aditi?
Yes, yes.
There's some connection. So, over other media, I believe the newspapers, like I told you, number one, they are more authentic. People still believe that newspaper, anything that is reported in newspaper is original in content. And there's a lot of trustworthiness. And when an article is written by a very credible scientific person, there's always in-depth analysis, and people tend to actually go into the depth of it, which often other medium tend to overlook,
Hmm.
which is not the case with newspapers. And it serves as a permanent record, newspaper, rather than online content, which you can today you say something, tomorrow it is
Hmm.
something else. But this serves as a record. In a lot of court cases, they've solely given their judgment based on newspaper articles. So that forms a great record, a record of evidence. And it's always verified generally. And also, even to this date, a lot of bureaucrats and policymakers, they trust newspapers, and they engage with them a lot. Even we as officers, we also believe that newspaper hold more credibility, and we give more new information to newspaper outlets rather than online platforms. So to that extent, I believe they hold a lot of edge. But I think that is where they also need to capitalize.
Okay. My next question was, how have you noticed any bias in how climate change is reported? And if so, what are they? Even though you have talked extensively over the negative and the positive reporting, I may skip over to the next question. Have you seen that newspaper reporting or coverage has affected people's willingness to take action on climate change?
I mean, actually, there are two parts to it. I mean, it's like, when how it has affected people in now, it has become a talking point. and it has become in accounting government, taking government to accountability,
Hmm.
in terms of policy making, in terms of uh, addressing larger issues.
Hmm.
They've affected, but when it comes to taking action on a day-to-day basis, I believe people's willingness to actually act on it, it has become a talking point, but as it actually converted into actionable points, wherein, say, I speak about climate change, I read about it, and I do believe that I should be a responsible citizen. But when it comes to, may say, if I construct a house, or and if there is a road that needs to be built, then I don't mind felling a couple of trees or something. So does it really, reading all these newspaper information and getting engaged, has it actually turned into actionable, this thing? I don't think that that is something that is still lacking. There's a lot of willingness.
Hmm.
People would want to change, they are changing,
Hmm.
but the pace is definitely slow.
Hmm.
And it is more, we talk about larger, this thing,
Hmm.
but when it comes to my own this thing, sometimes gets diluted. Although it is a good thing that people are shifting to solar, renewable, electric, and all that, which is also a good thing. It is happening, but I believe the pace is quite slow. But I still believe, through newspaper and media, this would actually, there would be a positive effect on this in the longer run.
Coming on to the last question, how can journalists better integrate scientific data with real life experiences to make climate change reporting more relatable?
So yeah, like I told before, one is that everything, every I think every piece of information or anything, that always it needs a good story to sell. So, and there has to be a connection between storytelling and scientific data.
Hmm.
So to that extent, that is how they can sell it. Secondly, they need to engage with the actual persons in the field, maybe quote or engage with the scientific community in a better way,
Hmm.
with the officials dealing with it. There are a lot of case studies also available which can be quoted, which is quite interesting also. So that is, and yes, there needs to be, it has to be data driven, it has to be scientific, and then it has to be, after engaging with the persons actually involved, particularly the scientific community. And ultimately, I would say it's all about content and narrative,
Hmm.
how the narrative is built and how it is presented. So that is how I think they can work upon it.
Okay. I'll just have an additional question to this.
Sure.
What strategies do you think would improve the depth and accuracy of climate change reporting in newspapers?
So strategies, to increase the depth in accuracy.
Hmm.
Okay. So I believe I've already answered this question.
Hmm.
I
Hmm.
think it is about engagement with the
Hmm.
policymakers,
Hmm.
engagement with the scientific community,
Hmm.
right? And also journalists who actually report. I believe they should also educate themselves, maybe through courses, or and I believe this is a very specialized subject. This is not a subject wherein
Hmm.
you can just report anything and write anything. I think
Hmm.
it needs to be, they need to go deep into it. Maybe researching more, or the journalists might seek help from good research scholars, or scientists to back their data, quote data from there's a lot of material available these days,
Hmm.
but also it has to be authentic from the government side, or from there's a lot of research going on the climate change aspect, or the global warming side also. I think that is how they can strategize and improve the depth of information that is being given,
Hmm.
and the accuracy. And of course, the more important thing is actually verify it on the ground. See, journalism, I believe it's all about reporting, ground truthing, right? You actually, one thing is data on the global scale, the other is going to the ground and seeing actually whether is that what is happening, and I think these are very, very commonsensical things that journalists can do, and that is how they can increase the depth and accuracy of information being provided.
Okay, as we conclude this insightful interview, I want to sincerely thank you, Reginald Royston, for sharing such valuable perspectives on climate change communication. Your expertise in environmental governance and public engagement has really shed light on the critical role of government officials. It's clear, again, that effective communication is key to driving climate action. I hope this conversation sparks further dialogue and action towards meaningful climate communication. Once again, I truly appreciate your time and insights. I look forward to staying connected and learning from your continued efforts in environmental conservation. Thank you and have a great day ahead.
Thank you so much, Aditi, and it was a wonderful conversation. And thanks for having me. And yeah, I believe, I mean, it's a great topic to discuss. So I
Yes.
also wish you all the best. It was wonderful.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.